Hello, everyone, and welcome to our sixth session on the Transboundary Water Series, which is also our last session, hosted by the Women in Law Initiative in Pakistan and curated by me. Once again, I'd like to thank Nida, the founder of Women in Law in Pakistan, for giving us a platform to have these conversations that are so important in the current geopolitical landscape. So, our final session today is titled Women Shaping Water, Careers, Leadership, and Impact. Throughout this series, we have explored some of the most pressing challenges facing water governance today, from climate change, transboundary cooperation, to human rights, armed conflict, and emerging technologies. For our final session, we want to shift the focus to the people who are working to address these challenges, and particularly to the role that women can play in shaping the future of water governance and what it can mean for you. Water governance is an inherently interdisciplinary field, bringing together law, policy, diplomacy, economists, development sector specialists, environmental protection people, and technological specialists. Yet, for many women interested in these areas, the pathways into water governance careers are not always obvious. At the same time, women continue to be underrepresented in many of the institutions and decision making spaces where critical choices about water resources are made, which affect them more than it affects men, as we've seen in our previous session. So today's session is therefore about careers and also about leadership and impact. We will hear from two very accomplished women about their own professional journeys, how the field has evolved over the course of their careers, the challenges and opportunities they see ahead, and why greater participation and leadership by women matters for the future of water governance. Most importantly, we hope this conversation provides young women, particularly those in Pakistan and South Asia, with a clearer sense of the opportunities that exist in this field globally and inspires them to see water governance not only as an important global challenge, but also as a space in which they can build meaningful careers and help shape the decisions that will define our collective water future. With that, I would like to introduce the speakers for this session, which includes Miss Jessica Troell and Miss Erum Sattar. I could not have thought of two better women to speak about their experiences as building a career in water governance. Both speakers have substantial careers spanning law, policy, research, international institutions, and academia. I'm going to start with a brief introduction of both. Ms. Troell is a senior attorney and director of the International Water Program at the Environmental Law Institute. She has over 2 decades of experience in international development and environmental law, with a focus on developing and implementing effective legal policy and institutional tools for inclusive and sustainable water governance. Jessica is a recognized authority on international, comparative, and transboundary water law and governance, water tenure, community based natural resource governance, gender inclusive water governance, climate resilient laws and policies, public participation in resource management, and the nexus between water governance and peace building. She has developed and implemented dozens of training and capacity building courses and workshops across numerous countries and for diverse stakeholders. Jessica is a member of the FAO Water Tenure Experts Group, IUCN World Conservation Union, Commission on Environmental Law Experts Group on Water and Wetlands, the Expert Group on Legal Issues for the United Nations World Water Assessment Program, the Association of Global Water Adaptation, and the International Association for Water Law. She is the author and editor of 2 books, over a dozen articles and book chapters, and numerous reports. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us today.
Thank you
We
so
then
much.
have with us Dr. Erum Sattar. Dr. Erum Sattar is an independent scholar, writer, and educator specializing in water law and policy, transboundary water governance, climate governance and adaptation, and food and agriculture systems. She holds an SJD from Harvard Law School and is a barrister at law of Lincoln's Inn. She previously served as senior advisor to the World Bank's 2030 Water Resources Group, where she contributed to establishing Pakistan's national multi-stakeholder partnership for water governance and provided substantive review of the Sindh water policy. She also served as program director of the Sustainable Water Management Graduate Program at Tufts University and has taught at the National University of Singapore School of Law, Northeastern University School of Law, and Pace University. Dr. Sattar is co-editor of the Cambridge Handbook of Islam and Environmental Law and has published extensively on water governance, environmental law, economic development, and climate-related issues. She currently serves on the advisory panel of Pakistan 2047 at LSE Ideas and as a member of the Water Sector Task Force at BNU Center for Policy Research. Thank you, Erum, for joining us today as well. I know both of you are very, very busy, so we are very, very grateful for you to take out time and have this conversation with us. I'm going to jump right in, and I'd like to begin by getting to know a little more about both of you and the journeys that brought you into the world of water governance. So, Jessica, I'd like to begin with what your journey has looked like. You have built a career spanning environmental law, international water governance, transboundary cooperation, and water diplomacy. How did you find your way into the field of water governance? In the sense, where did you start, and were there particular experiences or turning points that shaped the direction your career ultimately took?
Thank you so much, ma'am. And it's wonderful to be here. It's an honor to be sharing the stage with you, Dr. Sattar. This is wonderful. Yeah, no, I would say there have definitely been turning points. This all started for me at university a long time ago. Um, where I studied environmental studies and environmental education. So I kind of always knew that I wanted to have a career focused on environmental protection in some way or another, and really linking that to education and awareness raising. So on graduating from university, I joined the Peace Corps. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that, but it's a US-based volunteer organization, and I was assigned to work for the National Park Service in Morocco for 2 years as an environmental educator. And that would, I would say, was the first major turning point for me, was coming fresh out of university, really committed to raising awareness and building capacity in environmental protection, and then being confronted with the realities of communities who have had their resource rights curtailed, often not in a very consultative manner, seeing the plight of particularly women and their inability to have a voice in decision making at the local level around resource governance, because I lived in communities within these protected areas for 2 years. And so that was really the first kind of eye-opening experience for me, understanding the linkages between really human rights and environment, and understanding the balance that really needed to be struck between conservation and community development. And that really sort of sent me on a trajectory that I think I've maintained until today, 30 years later, really focusing on how do we blend conservation with community rights, and particularly women's rights. And how do we structure our environmental and water governance regimes so that we can increase legal literacy, increase the advocacy capacity of communities to do these things, but also what are the legal frameworks that need to be in place to provide both substantive rights and also procedural rights to make sure that communities and in particular, women within communities have the ability to have the access to information that they need to be able to advocate for themselves, and that they have the substantive rights to participate in decision making and governance. So when I came back from Morocco after 2 years, I had sort of a short and ill-fated stint in private consulting, where I worked with private companies on compliance assistance. I was asked when I gave my notice, I think I was only 8 months into that. When I gave my notice, I was asked to quietly leave because I was poisoning the ears of the other employees, because really they were spin doctors. It was sort of a private consulting firm that worked for Fortune 50 companies. But that all worked out really, really well for me, because the job that I got from there was with the Environmental Law Institute as a research associate. And I spent almost 3 years there working with attorneys and learning about basically how you can use the law and environmental rule of law to really achieve the kinds of goals that I was very passionate about achieving. And I was able to work actually extensively in India during that time. So I was exposed to more international work and the possibilities of working globally on some of these issues and the types of institutions that were active, and decided to go to law school from there. Um, During law school, I would say my sort of the final pivot point that I would take a lesson from was uh, I worked during the summers. I got internships for the Natural Resources Defense Council and the United States Environmental Protection Agency Office of General Counsel. And both of those were just incredible experiences, exposing me to very different ways of leveraging a legal education to protect the environment, to work on water issues, and very different perspectives as a government, employee advising the government on how to create and implement and enforce environmental laws versus NRDC, where it was really advocacy oriented. And the turning point there that I would say was when I worked back in the day on the human right to water, in particular in South Africa, and I got an idea in my head that I would love to go and do applied research on this. But that had never been done at the University of Virginia Law School. No one had ever done an international externship before. So I created the first international externship. I reached out to Wits University in Johannesburg and had an advisor who had helped write the new water law and embed the human right to water. And I created a research program with a colleague of mine that we then went and spent a semester implementing in South Africa, which was an incredible experience. I still work with colleagues that I've met in South Africa today. Um, and it was a real turning point for me. And I would say that for people going into graduate school or starting your PhD or whatever, don't be constrained by what you think are the rules or limitations. You can create all sorts of opportunities for yourself. You can reach out to people and create relationships that will lead to opportunities for internships, for volunteering, for going overseas to different places. Just different kind of work that you want to engage in, and don't be afraid to reach out to professionals who are doing the work that you think you are passionate about, to say, what can I do? How can I get involved? How can I learn more? Because they're more often than not, you will get a wonderful response and good advice. And you'll also start to form, I think, really critical relationships that will guide you and help you make your way through your career. Um, so yeah, I'll end there. That was plenty of time of me talking. I apologize.
Thank you so much, Jessica. No, that was a very good intro to how your career has been, and also very helpful for people to know. Uh, Dr. Erum, we're going to move on to you now. So, your career has taken you from working at, interestingly, public health to development in Pakistan, to law, to academia, international development, and ultimately water governance. So, you've seen a diverse range of careers and fields. Could you take us through that journey and tell us what drew you specifically to water at the end as an area for your research and professional practice? And I know you did your PhD in the same area as well. So why did you pick water in the end?
Thank you, Maham, for having us. This is an amazing conversation. And Jessica, trust me, the honor is mine because I have really so much was resonating. It's absolutely wonderful. So, yes, you're absolutely right. What I did was a very, it's a very roundabout kind of way of approaching where I landed. And what's amazing is that 15 years out, I can really see like a consistent theme. So I'll see if I can tie it together. It's fascinating. I started my sort of like development work on the ground in Pakistan, working in public health and reproductive health. And that was fascinating because I worked with highly underserved communities who were excluded, marginalized, a lot with women. There were not proper hospital facilities. So I sort of like traveled the depth and breadth of, sort of the country. And I think understanding things from that perspective really helps because you have a real grounding. Later on, when I came, so I'm skipping, later on, when I was doing my graduate work, what was also interesting is that I was fortunate enough to work with the real legend in water who was called John Briscoe. And he happened to be my professor, and he was my sort of like field supervisor. He was, the main person who was guiding me. But at the same time, while I was doing my graduate work, normally what ends up happening is people do their fields readings and then they go into the field, right? So it's like the opposite. But in my case, what happened is that our chance to go in country with Professor John Briscoe, we were doing this comparative of countries with federal structures and trying to figure out how the different federal structures and transboundary rivers work across. So we looked at the Murray-Darling in Australia. We looked at Brazil. We obviously looked at the Indus. Fascinating comparative international project. But the way that it transpired was that we had to do our field work before we did other readings. That was eye-opening. And Professor Briscoe was very, very clear that if you are really interested in understanding what is really happening on the ground, literally go talk to, the people who are operating the canals on a daily basis. Just try and figure out what are the decisions they are making, how are they making them, what is their rationale. And don't first come with like your I'm from, some university hat and tell them how to do things. Because honestly, while you're sleeping, the canals are working. Something is happening, okay? So be really humble. So that's, I think, what happened with me for both, for my public health as well as for my doctoral fieldwork. And the fieldwork happened before I did my field. So one of my main sort of like pieces of advice to people now is really see as much real world experience as you can before coming to sort of, read the papers and do that kind of work, because you ask much better questions of that same material that you're reading, because you've been in the field, you have experienced what a provincial irrigation department looks like and feels like and who is there. Talk about marginalization. Are people like you there? Are any women there? Are any women who are affected by those decisions that are made every day in some provincial headquarters in those spaces? And you will, once you've been in there, you will see clearly that no, they're not. There's like literally no one from these communities who is in those very bureaucratic kind of spaces. And the reason I was able to get in is because I was coming, in from this kind of like privileged as a way position, but with a professor who was very highly respected and ended up also, he wrote the World Bank's first like water policy, and got the Stockholm Prize, and we lost him too soon to cancer. But I was coming with this person, so at least I could get into the door. And when we come to advice, that's the one thing that I would really like to speak to. So it's a criticism both of the governance structures, because Jessica was mentioning, reach out to people, and people will be very open. And that is absolutely true. That's without a doubt, that is correct. But there is still a divide. I think that people perhaps in the non-governmental spaces, in sort of like more the NGO world, obviously within academia, perhaps even within the private sector, will be a lot more open. But at least coming from South Asia, I know for a fact that government spaces are still very restricted and are very limited in the space that they open up. If you just want to come in and, shadow someone, right? And you want to figure out what exactly is happening in this office kind of thing. So what I would, it's a two-way thing. I think we have to keep pushing. We have to keep saying to these places that, you need us to be involved. You will do better work. And likewise, we need these spaces to be more open. So it's kind of like a pull and push. We'll have to do both. And if we don't do both, we will not open more space up to get more diverse points of view in there. We will just not have people who are affected by decisions involved in any of the decision making, which I think is what we're all after, which is true. And finally, the thing that I'd like to say is with me and water, what was fascinating was that I had gotten, so I'd done a master's. And then while I was doing this LLM, I realized that if I really wanted to understand something really fundamental about like governance and economic development and historical trajectories, I needed to understand the control of water. I'm not sure how that happened, but it was an insight while I was like going through these studies. And from then on, I have been fascinated. Water is an amazing lens to just look at everything. It's really unbelievable. And I mean, as we speak here today, we've just had the massive glacial collapse in Nepal at with the border with, Tibet and China. And I mean, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people dead and missing. There is massive devastation. So, if you are interested in any aspect of water, from like clean drinking water to, like disaster relief, taking a lens of water is actually really helpful because you can understand things in a structural way. So I would urge anyone to, yeah, dive into your interests and do it through water.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erum. So that's actually a very good segue into what you just said into my next question, which is basically that both of you have been working in this field for many years, and water governance itself has evolved considerably during that time. So I'd like to now turn to some of the changes that you have witnessed and the challenges that are shaping the field today. So we're going to go back to Jessica. Jessica, you have worked in international water governance for more than 2 decades. What are some of the biggest changes you have witnessed in the field during that time? And what new challenges do you think the next generation of water professionals will have to confront?
Thanks. I think it's a really important question right now in particular. And my colleagues and I have really been trying to do some strategic and sort of hard thinking, difficult on both a personal and professional level, thinking about the trajectory that we're seeing. I started this work in the 90s, in the 1990s, and at that time, the international work that we were doing was really building civil society capacity to follow, track, advocate, and build rule of law around environmental and water issues. And it was a really exciting time because there seemed to be a surge, of new water legislation or revised water legislation and opportunities, integrated water resource management and, sort of new ideas around how we needed to really tackle kind of the most pressing issues around water governance. Climate was emerging as one of the most pressing challenges. There were so many things, and I think, Erum, what you were saying rings so true to me in terms of, water is the lens that connects everything, and really, I think that's what led me to it as well. Was, you can do anything through the lens of water. You can work on human rights. You can work on climate change. You can work on, you know, yeah, community development. You can work on however, women's issues, whatever you want to do. It's all there, and it's all connected to water. And and I think, again, in the beginning, we were on this really sort of upwards trajectory of acceptance that the governance aspects of this were really fundamental and critical, that we had a lot of the challenges that we were facing weren't just technical. They were really governance challenges. And that, in the beginning, I remember sort of as we would seek funding for our work at the Environmental Law Institute, going out and really having to kind of explain, what do we mean by environmental governance, and how do you actually show improvements in water governance over time, and what does that look like, and what kind of work we were doing, and really, distilling for ourselves what is the sort of suite of activities that you need to be doing when you're trying to improve water governance. So we work around the world in different countries. We help with developing legislation and regulations. We help by training advocates and judges and lawyers on implementing and enforcing the laws. But we also work on sort of, again, this critical aspect of sort of community-based rights and fundamentally around equitable allocation of water and what governance systems need to be doing in order to be able to function more equitably and in response to sort of uh, colonial histories, to be honest, that have embedded legal frameworks that are not necessarily functional in the environments where they're working. And I think another thing that Dr. Erum really highlighted that I would reinforce over and over again is um, being in the field, understanding how these things actually happen in practice, working with communities, working with civil society, and understanding how government actually needs to practice what they're doing in terms of the constraints that they're facing. In addition to, there's this idea that government's holding information really closely, or maybe they're not as accessible. But I lived for the last, I moved back to the United States about 3 years ago. Before that, I was about 13 years in Southern Africa, in Malawi and in Zimbabwe. And in both of those places, the resource constraints and the capacity constraints of people who are trying their hardest to really do amazing work. It's really hard to see. And so I would say that perspective of getting out and really understanding what it is like to be, an advocate for these things from a civil society perspective, what it is like to be on the government side and really have those resource constraints, but also have, maybe the ability to influence regulatory development and implementation, those kinds of things is absolutely essential. But coming back to this kind of trajectory, I would say, it felt like we were past all of sort of the fundamental arguments of why is water governance important. And we had just this proliferation of institutions and, amazing people working on everything from, peace building and water governance to, improving, achieving the MDGs into the SDGs and the human rights linkages and all of that. And we've seen a sudden, it's been more progressive than maybe it felt like, but we've seen a shuttering, as we all know, of kind of the open space for these discussions and a real pushback, not just on civil society being able to advocate for environmental and water protections and water governance, but also in governments feeling like they can invest. They've never really invested enough in water governance. It's the figures are really often shocking around, less than 1% of government budgets often go towards water development and water governance. But um, even so, we're seeing, pushback on investments at the country level, at the international level. We're seeing multilateral processes really break down. We're seeing fundamental trust that's been built up over decades through those multilateral processes really being broken. We're seeing civil society being constrained by law, but also by corrupt practices and really not able to advocate in the way that, they've been able to do over the last decades. We are seeing environmental defenders and water defenders being killed in increasing numbers in places, and this becoming it can be a very bleak picture if you look at it that way. At the same time, I would say this means it's more fundamental than ever that young women professionals enter this space and have their voices heard and are able to shape how we rebuild these processes in new and more inclusive ways. Um, we, again, this idea that sort of, maybe at this point we're not going to have big multilateral negotiations going on around some of the key issues around climate and water that we would have hoped to in the past. But there are coalitions of the willing. There are countries that are really willing to work on these issues and organizations that are fundamentally driven to keep us moving in the right direction. And and I would say there's also opportunities to rethink strategically as you're coming up in your profession around the roles of different sectors in water governance and the kinds of partnerships that can be formed and what we need to be doing to leverage new technologies, and what are the guardrails that we need to be putting in place for new technologies like artificial intelligence so that we are able to protect ourselves from some of the fallout. um, the landscape is really changing, and particularly if you're interested in doing international work or global work, I think, but it's also resilient in many ways. And so I would say, it provides really interesting opportunities for again, for kind of rethinking. Yeah, we would sit around and have conversations in Zimbabwe, like, should we be here as international development professionals, right? Like, what is our role here? Is it just propping up I mean, I'm going to be very straightforward. Is it just propping up a corrupt government that's taking advantage of, USAID, basically funding their health and water sectors, because they're not putting their own investments into it? I completely disagree with the dismantling of international development. At the same time, there were problems and there were challenges that now is a really interesting time to kind of get involved in bigger picture thinking around what does the landscape need to look like for us to effectively provide support to uh, low and middle income countries. And in particular, I would come back to the community perspective and say, now is the time to really think about whose voices need to be heard in water governance, and how do we open that whole picture up to not just women, but indigenous peoples, local communities, and start to recalibrate what we think about what knowledge is valuable in making water governance decisions, and how do we value different perspectives and bring them on board, and what do institutions need to look like at the local level, at the national level, at the transboundary level, and at the global level, in order to facilitate that more kind of diverse and inclusive approach, not just to water governance, but to environmental governance more broadly. But I would say, focusing in on water governance. And I've been doing some really exciting work with partners around the world for the last decade on water tenure, which is really kind of about this idea of equitable allocation, rethinking um, how we manage water from the perspective of equitable allocation and sustainability, and how do we manage in an increasingly water scarce environment, how do we manage that? And how do we manage our understanding of water governance in a changing climate? I think that is going to be another one of the most pressing issues that, we've seen really. We all see the outcomes now. We see the floods that you were just talking about. We see, I mean, everything. It's all happening now. And so, there's this incredible pressure, and it can seem overwhelming, but at the same time, now is the time to sort of garner the political will, and start to think about, how do we start to re-engage on some of the governance innovations that we've been talking about for years, in terms of, again, more public participation in decision making. How do we change sort of our frameworks for water governance more broadly? What does it look like to embed that in transboundary decision making? How, one of the things that we've been trying to think about is sort of from a transboundary perspective, how do we bridge that gap between what is essentially country to country relationships and track one diplomacy with track two and track three diplomacy that engages with communities, engages with women, and really has the decision making informed by the stakeholders who are most impacted and most vulnerable to all of these impacts. So, sorry, I'm reading a real quick. Yes. Okay. No, that's a really good question. Nida was saying sometimes that you can't focus in on a specific area of water governance at university. How do you kind of come to this from different angles? And I would say, again, coming back to the fact that whatever water is so cross-cutting, that I actually had to decide, do I want to go to a law school that focuses on environment and really has a huge environmental law program? Or do I want to go to a law school that sort of like, a bit more broadly has like a really well-respected program, and I can get a more well-rounded legal education, but create opportunities for myself to focus on environmental and water law? And I decided to do the latter. And it was really an incredible opportunity because you can find one professor that is willing to help you make those connections. and to forge a research path for yourself at the even at the undergraduate level. And again, I think being proactive and exploring different areas and reaching out to people to create those opportunities for yourself really enables you to do things even at a place where you would think, oh, well, this isn't something that everybody does. It doesn't have to be. You can create those opportunities and you can reach out to other institutions and, nonprofit organizations or other academic institutions too, to kind of, leverage those connections as well. I'll stop there because I've been talking for a very long time.
Uh, Thank you so much, Jessica. That was very, very helpful for people to know as well. And the fact that, yes, there are opportunities, but you also have to like make a value judgment at times. We're going to now move on to Erum. Erum, looking back at your own experience, are there issues or approaches that were relatively peripheral when you entered the field, but have now become central to water governance? And what does that evolution tell us about where the field is heading now? And what could it mean for younger water professionals in mostly South Asia?
So I'm going to address that in two ways. One, I know we have some amazing comments from Nida, which are very, very helpful for helping frame exactly this question and my response to it. So I think what is the problem, and I'll pick up on something that Jessica also said. So the issue is that a lot of the actual water governance frameworks and structures, and I will speak specifically in the context of Pakistan, are actually colonial era inheritances. They are very much written in English, and there is basically no translation of them into any local languages, even. So if you are from anywhere, you have to read these in English. And that to me is amazingly fascinating. Part of that is what I was trying to research, right? And we can really critique that. So it keeps away, it's like a boundary, right? Because not everybody can access all of the language that it's written in. Some of the inheritance is almost taken as if it is the norm. And that's what I think we really need to start working on, right? The way something in the 1800s was developed was according to very different, say, colonial era purposes and a very different control structure. Meanwhile, we're now in 2026, and there is very good climate science that is telling us that by 2100, by the end of the century, we could lose up to a third, for instance, or a half of global glaciers. That is incredible because glaciers provide about at least 50 to 60% of river melt and really affect climate cycles and rainfall patterns. So the fundamental ground that we are going to be living on is completely different from what the legal frameworks were designed to address. And that's what we need to sort of start calling out. It's very difficult to do it without having some sense of what is the law, when was it written, who was it serving, and is it still fit for purpose, right? So those are like my questions. And one of the things that I have been encouraging, sort of like the professional sector, the legal sector, the government sector in Pakistan, at least for a while, is that the study of water governance more broadly needs to really start to be built into curricula. As Jessica was saying, there are always individual professors who will let you design something that you are interested in and go ahead and do it. The problem is, how do you fold that into something that is for credit, and then that'll actually help you get your degree, right? So we need institutional backing also. We need institutions to start adjusting. That for me is the biggest thing. What has changed is that there is a little more openness at least the level of professionals or professors who are interested in saying, no, absolutely, this is a problem. And how do we study it? But we are still not structurally enabling enough people to go ahead and actually understand how do you learn all of this stuff, which is very complex, which is interconnected, and then what do you do with it? And I think one of the things, like for instance, this format that you've got, right? This forum, this series, I think is a very good idea to keep the discussion going. It is a way for people to know that people like us exist and for them to be able to reach out to us. And I think that there is a way to start pushing these conversations forward. And I'll tell you something which is very interesting, and this is the reason of like why would you get into the field and why would you have actual conversations with people. I remember that many years ago, while I was doing some of my field work, I was in the irrigation department in Punjab, and we were talking about the transboundary Indus Waters Treaty, sort of like, and how is it operated? How do you guys experience it, kind of thing. And the person I was meeting with, fascinating. He literally opened the top right drawer of his desk and he pulled out the manual of like the operating manual. He's like, "Oh, you want to know how what we do? Well, here it is. This is what we do," kind of thing, right? And while that was absolutely fascinating, that is literally on the top drawer of his, it's right there with him, and that's how much he's internalized it. To a researcher like me, the question is, why are you operating something of this structure? Is it serving your economic development needs? Is it serving nutritional security? What exactly is it achieving that this is what you're following, right? And I think that's what we need to somehow start encouraging. We need to start asking these questions of, wonderful, this is what you're doing. Is it working on its own stated purposes? And then looking forward to 2050, to 2100 and beyond, is it really working? The thing is, the structure is changing. If you look at the complete drought that is affecting even places like Europe this year, it is massive. There is a huge reduction in yields of crops of dairy across Europe. We got figures, tentative figures from places like France yesterday, that there could be 1/3 of a reduction in dairy production. I actually have like sort of like work on this because I've really looked at the dairy sector in Pakistan very closely. A lot of work in the agricultural sector, especially in dairy production, is done by women in those households because it is considered beneath the dignity of men to be working in dairy. So a lot of dairy work is done by women. Meanwhile, it is very productive for that household. One, it gives you nutritional security, it gives you protein, and it gives you something to sell. But if you do not have 1/3 of what you would have normally produced to be able to sell, that is a huge hit to household incomes. So I think we need to be asking, how do we address changes? What I've seen is, and this is what Jessica was also, sort of saying also, in a way, it's very sad to be able to work in something in which what you were worried about and working on is coming true, right? So now drought is coming true. We can see it. It's literally having an impact on people's dairy agricultural income in places like France, which nobody had on their horizon, some years ago, kind of thing. So this is where we are. So we are really living in a drastically changing world, and we have to be asking, are we what are we doing, and are we doing something that is serving us and our future generations? For me, that's like my driving question. That's all I want to understand. Like, we're doing this, but well, why are we doing this? And that asking why we have to encourage, especially when you come to post-colonial societies like a lot of the world is, asking the why is considered very challenging, right? So you have to sort of like, and especially, I mean, please, like I'm like a, like a desi woman kind of thing, right? But I'm coming here and trying to ask the why. So there, obviously there has to be a way you're doing it, right? You don't want to be like super confrontational because otherwise people will shut down, may not share things with you. But you have to figure out a way to ask the challenging questions and keep and build relationships, and then bring more people into the fold, right? More people to be excited about, this is really worth spending your time and life thinking about and working in. So it's, for me, it's very sad that this stuff is true, but it's also a hugely exciting opportunity where people just have to keep pushing and asking authorities of, No, there needs to be room for my voice in this room.
Thank you, Erum. And that's very helpful for people to also understand to like not give up, and the fact that dairy and the agricultural sector is also a huge issue in Pakistan as well. So that's very helpful. But my next my next type of question is the fact that while these changes bring new challenges, they're also creating new opportunities and career pathways. Like both of you spoke about, like working with communities directly, or the other issues that are peripheral to water governance or used to be, but are in the center of it. So I'd like to now talk about where those opportunities are emerging and what they might mean for the next generation of water professionals. So, going back to Jessica, water governance today intersects with, as you said, climate change, particularly like in places like Africa with peace and security, human rights, like you spoke about the human right to water, technology, development, and ultimately, particularly in the transboundary context, diplomacy. So,
Mhm.
what new professional opportunities do you think are emerging from these intersections, particularly for young lawyers and women who may not traditionally have thought of water as a career path, but are interested in one of these intersecting fields?
Thank you for that. That's a really great question. And I would say, Dr. Aram, you you set me up perfectly for this next question because of what you said earlier. The themes that you brought up and sort of the trends that you brought up, I think are the central ones to be paying attention to as a young lawyer, as a young woman, kind of thinking about entering into the water field that essentially we've had, a transition over the last 30 to 40 years from thinking about water as a technical issue and an issue of, supply management to an issue that is so multivariate and so diverse, and starting to take into account the different values that different communities associate with water, that women associate with water, the different priorities and the needs for, much more inclusive governance processes. But what does that mean for opportunities in water law? And I guess I would take this opportunity to really talk about sort of where I've been trying to head with strategic thinking around this. And the first really is exactly what Dr. Aram was saying. Decolonization of water laws is one of the things that has come out as one of the most critical and fundamental aspects. It's this question, I think, of both, is this fit for purpose in the place where it's functioning? Are these laws and institutions and procedures and planning processes functional, given not just the need to be more inclusive, but also given the resource constraints, given the capacity constraints? It's wonderful to have, I spent a lot of time in South Africa. They have a beautiful, beautiful water law, with all of the best intentions of emerging from apartheid, and very, very divisive society to this much more collective and restorative justice framework. And they've struggled tremendously over the last 25 years to implement that because of capacity constraints and also because of political will. And the fact is that water is a political issue, and it will always be an issue that is intricately related to power struggle. Countries ultimately will allocate water where they can economically develop. And so our whole framework for thinking about what does water governance do, it's not just fit for purpose, but also fit for whose purpose. Um, and and who, who needs to be influencing those decisions. So, I've been really trying to think about, again, I come back to this water tenure work because it really has, and what I mean by water tenure is sort of looking at water rights and access and use to water more broadly than just legal access and rights, but also looking at all of the different systems, customary, indigenous, local, traditional, even informal, that may be considered illegal but sort of overlooked by the government that are in place to make sure people always need to have access to water and they will continue to use water for their purposes, right? We don't really have a lot of information on what happens on the ground and how that fits with these legal frameworks a lot of the time, particularly in rural areas. And so, this idea of understanding from a kind of tenure perspective or a rights-based perspective of, what's missing from decision making and water governance is really the core one. And what we've seen is, we've taken it as a given for over 100 years now that permitting is a great idea. Permitting is the way to track water use. It's the way to get money to the government for water use. It's the way to, it's from a governance perspective, it has many benefits. It is also completely not fit for purpose for the vast majority of rural users or for the governments who are trying to implement them. Many studies have shown in sub-Saharan Africa, we did a comparative study across 5 countries that showed that I think it's less than 8% of those who are required to have permits actually have them because the government simply doesn't have the capacity to do it, nor do the users have the capacity and the resources to go to the city, apply for a permit, understand what the law requires of them. If you ask people in at the village level, do you have a permit for that well? They'll look at you like you're crazy. Why would I have a permit for my well? First of all, water comes from God is the first thing that you always hear. Or it is, it's just a community right. And so there's a huge, huge disjunct between what we've created with these colonial era and post-colonial era that have adopted a lot of the structures from colonial era laws and what's actually happening on the ground and what people need in order to function both with their individual rights and their collective rights. And so I think there's a huge shift that needs to take place around um, how do we account for, I would say, legal pluralism, which is basically the simultaneous, or overlapping existence of legal frameworks, but also customary frameworks, indigenous frameworks, and how do we bring those together in a way that provides the kind of legal recognition and protection for communities that are necessary to recognize and guarantee their rights, but also not take away the essential adaptive nature and local uh, sort of legitimacy that those systems often have in place. Now, I'm not romanticizing them. There are a lot of customary structures that are terrible when it comes to women's rights. And there's a lot of linkages between water rights and land rights that continue to exclude women and really need, huge reforms at all levels. But there are also things to be learned from local community practices and to be embedded in what local water governance procedures that we don't account for in law at all. And we often keep reinventing the wheel and coming down and saying, hey, why don't you form a water user association? Well, we already have a mechanism for making these decisions in the community level. Why don't we build on those instead? And it's a confusing picture and it's very context specific. So I would say, you know, some of these bigger picture questions are not about coming up with a silver bullet or a one answer. It's about understanding the complexities of how this functions in very diverse contexts, being able to draw out what lessons may apply across different areas, but also to be able to go into Pakistan or a specific place and say, right here, right now, this is what needs to happen in order to be fit for purpose and in order to be inclusive and accountable. So that's one kind of big, huge shift that I see. And the other is really recognizing kind of the failures, the persistent failures that we've had over time. We keep coming back to integrated water resource management, and we keep coming back to sort of but what that belies is a failure to really see the interconnectedness of water across not just sort of water subsectors, whether that's drinking water, irrigation water, those kinds of things, but across all sectors. And really fundamentally thinking about, if you ask any country or anyone working in any country, often they'll say, you know, we have institutional fragmentation, there's a lack of coordination across sectors, We have several different planning processes that go into deciding who gets what water. Often the mining people get the water, or the agriculture people get the water, because those are the ones who are, contributing most to GDP, to the economic health of, or perceived economic health of the country. These kinds of things require new and innovative solutions. And simply sort of repeating over and over again that we need to have better coordination, better policy coherence, better all of these things begs the question of, is there a fundamental shift that needs to happen where we need to be thinking? And I've been doing some really, really interesting work with some water lawyers from many different countries, thinking about what does freshwater rule of law look like? We think about environmental rule of law, and we think about the notion that we have environmental laws in place, that we kind of understand, what we need from a regulatory perspective. But implementation and enforcement continues to be such a huge challenge, and we see the same patterns over and over again in so many different countries. So, what are sort of the fundamental principles that would guide us towards better implementation and enforcement from a freshwater perspective? Do we want to have, integrated water resource management where we sort of say to everyone, you need to consider, we need to embed water throughout all decision making? Or do we need to have strategic relationships built with the mining sector, for example, that really focus on, when mining interests come into a place and they're permitting, what are the specific ways in which we can integrate water and mining permitting in order to protect communities' rights, in order to protect the health of the ecosystem, those kinds of things. So very specific. I mean, and again, I'm not saying I have an answer, but it's really thinking, I hate to say this, but it's really thinking outside the box of, we don't, the givens of water governance are not necessarily fit for purpose, as Dr. Erum was saying. And so this kind of really innovative thinking of, we have these sort of colonial era laws that are persisting, the permitting systems that aren't really functioning. We have, institutional frameworks that are path dependent on these fragmented ways of planning and decision making that aren't serving us. Let's get creative, and let's think about new ways of doing it that really are, tailorable to the specific circumstances. So I would say those kinds of issues. And then at the transboundary level, of course, we see an increase in conflict. It's horrible, but we're going to continue to see an increase in conflict. One of the places that I've been doing a concentrated level of work has been in Eastern Chad, in Africa. And there you have a perfect storm of extremely arid conditions, a history of conflict between pastoralists and farmers that is only getting worse because pastoralists' water points are drying up. Uh, Farmers are looking for more land because it's less productive, because there's the rainy seasons changing and crops have to be planted at different times. So there's new openings for conflict. At the same time, the conflict across the border in Sudan has a flood of refugees coming across the whole time, and it they're becoming permanent residents. It's been years and years. And so now the government of Chad, in this very fragile and conflict affected environment, is now thinking, well, now how do we get water to all of these newly formed settlements? So these kinds of issues with climate refugees, with, conflict affected and fragile countries, where you have to really rethink the fundamental basis for who has rights to water, and how do we meet those needs, and how do we think about things from a rights-based perspective, um, and embed that in water governance, national and transboundary water governance processes, is really, I think, something that we need to be looking towards as we move forward.
Thank you, Jessica. And that's a very good segue into what I'm going to ask Erum, because I'm going to ask her to zone in on Pakistan again. And Erum, Pakistan faces some of the world's most complex water governance challenges as well. So, for you, and you've talked about the fact that the institutional space in Pakistan is still very like closely knit, and it's hard to break into. But where do you see some of the greatest opportunities for young professionals, and particularly for women, to contribute meaningfully to the future of water governance in Pakistan?
So I actually think this is really interesting. And what I'll do is I'll build off of some of the stuff that Jessica was saying. So specifically, look, there is actually a lot of innovation happening because it's much easier to look at all of the problems and the gaps, but there is innovation happening, right? So there is actually a lot of innovation happening uh, in sort of like trying to figure out, for instance, energy capture or getting carbon credits or trying to figure out how can Pakistan qualify for a lot of funding opportunities from, say, the Green Climate Fund. So there are a lot of opportunities, and a lot of places are, and a lot of small groups are getting together and saying, well, gee, how do we tap some of these funds, right? Because clearly we need the funding. Because on the structural level, the problem stuff doesn't get funded, even though very good policies, are there on paper across a number of sectors. We're very, very good at making policies. The problem is that the institutional base behind that doesn't exist. And the real problem is that we don't have the funding to make those things work. So any government institution you go to will say, look, this sounds amazing. We would love to do it. How do we find a project to be able to do it? And that project-based financing is, in fact, so much of the hurdle to getting things done. Because on a day-to-day basis, you have so many hours and everyone's time is dedicated to doing whatever they're doing. And there's just not enough funding to do more. So a lot of smaller places are coming together to try and innovate. For instance, Pakistan has a huge delta, right? And in that delta, communities actually do a lot, for instance, of shrimp farming and shrimp harvesting. And that is protein security, so that is nutritional security for those communities, but it also has some kind of surplus. There's a domestic market for that kind of food, and then there's obviously export markets. So across that value chain, really supporting communities to build up those skill sets and then trying to figure out, okay, if we could export shrimp, what kind of phytosanitary things do we need to comply with, right? And then how do we develop this? I think that's where the opportunities are. The opportunities are local and the opportunities are specific. And that's how you have to like identify project by project. I'll give you another example. In places, there is now a lot of interest, especially with this sort of like new administration here in the US, which is saying, let's try and figure out what is happening with rare earths and critical minerals, right? So there is a lot of mining potential in parts of Pakistan, which have obviously, say Balochistan, massive province, in enormous complex history of itself. But mining is local water resource very intense. And there are already huge question marks about, is the aquifer going to support the needs for mining, right? And that's where we need to sort of involve local people. So from across sectors, whether it looks like an economic development sector, whether it looks like, oh, can we be producing milk better and sort of like, selling it, or can we be exporting shrimp into the Gulf or far, East Asia? What can we be doing? These kinds of things are what people have to get involved with, in that they are actual opportunities. So there was a previous sort of question about like, do parents see the utility of this kind of work for their kids? Because I think parents are thinking, well, we've invested, in our kids' education. What are they actually going to do? What are they going to study? What do they know? And I think all of these are actual practical examples, right? You can absolutely work with Delta communities to do ecosystem protection, just habitat protection locally. That gives you a livelihood to be able to say, develop shrimp farming. So very specific things are what people will have to get involved with. And that's sort of like the main thing. So trying to figure out how can we apply for credits for like other projects so that funding could come in. But lastly, and this is when Jessica was talking about sort of like Zimbabwe, the country has to take responsibility, right? Even though they are very, very good policies, those very good policies, basically the problem is that the government's own support in terms of the actual sort of structure, the institutional structure of how is it getting put together, who's going to work on it, those deliverables have not been worked out. And that's what we need to sort of like keep pushing government that, look, the planet is warming. Climate change is absolutely real. Pakistan feels it every year. There is either a fluctuation between floods and droughts, and more this is becoming evident around the world. This year, the Colorado River is in a massive crisis, for instance, in the US, and it is about transboundary cooperation and sort of like what are the limits of that cooperation? What are the limits of legal strategies in a changing world? That's what we have to sort of think from. So, and so I think the specific opportunities on this sense is what we really need to focus on. Where are the opportunities for doing mining better? Where is the opportunity to doing dairy agricultural work better? Is there a way to protect rural livelihoods as well as develop the sector? So it has to be very, very precise. It has to be project by project, as it were, or firm by firm, opportunity by opportunity. That's the only way to do it. And on a structural level, I think one of the things just to support this work that has to happen is that we absolutely must keep speaking. So I happen to be a lawyer by training, and I absolutely, and again, this was a question sort of that was in the comments. I find it unbelievable that for Pakistan, for a country such as Pakistan, which has the largest contiguous irrigation network structure, canal structure in the world by like land mass and distance, right? The fact that there is no uh, sort of college that studies, a law college that has a course on water law. I find that fascinating. And what a gap for a country with that large an agricultural endowment that does not study and where lawyers don't train actually to figure out what are these rights-based issues, what are these colonial legal endowments, right? The fact that we don't study this or do not have these available is to me honestly astounding. And there was many years ago, there was a conference that, a chief justice of the Supreme Court had arranged on sort of like water sharing. And that was my comment then, that basically, look, this is a gap. These problems are only going to get worse. And because these problems are going to get worse, what do organizations and what do educational institutions have to do? And what do places like the Bar Council have to do? Right? Study this stuff formally, develop expertise, and when those opportunities are there, then people will be able to go and say, oh, this is a career path for me. It makes a lot of sense to do it. So, simple things. We must be studying things like water law and policy. We must be teaching this in at least the legal sphere, which I'm speaking specifically to, but more broadly, all of social science. I mean, so much of this has massive amounts of overlap. So I think we just need to keep encouraging that, look, this has to happen. We are sitting at a very precarious time, and that precarious time requires that you study it. The other thing that I would mention is that there are communities around the world. Just look at the noise. This is not Pakistan specific, but look at the noise in the US right now that is going on about, for instance, data centers. A lot of the data center debate is its taxing of local resources and local water resources. So, any kind of industrial development, I mentioned specifically mining, that may or may not happen in Balochistan, right? That has massive taxing of the underground water aquifer to data centers. All of these industries across the spectrum are heavy users of water. You want to put in a nuclear power plant, you usually put it where there is a cool freshwater source to cool that power center. One of the things that happened again in the massive droughts that are happening, France relies for a massive amount of its energy on nuclear power plants. Some of those nuclear power plants actually had to be shut down because there was not enough water level in the rivers to be able to keep those centers cool. So water will impact basically everything, right? Your electricity security, to nutrition security. I mean, those are the fundamental parts of life. I mean, you need food. In these days, you certainly need power, you need energy. So we have to keep sort of like beating the drum and saying to our institutions that you need to develop proper programs of study so that younger people coming in can really engage with these problems, learn, and that's when opportunities will develop. Because if we ignore it, it's not like the problem is going to go away. The drought is not going to happen because you are not, sort of like paying attention to it, right? Yields will fall. That will happen regardless. Reality exists, kind of thing. And it'll be better served. We will be better served, especially in places like Pakistan or across, really, if we study these things hard and give opportunities for people. So I think those are like sort of like my things. I think we have to keep encouraging institutions to say this stuff is a real problem. And I think, people see, like people themselves see that it's a problem. They just don't know where to go interact with these problems from or how to learn about them. So the only thing to do is keep saying, no, there has to be more and more and more.
Thank you, Erum. And I think that's very useful to now go into our next segment, which is to talk about. So people need to talk about it, and there is institutional gaps that need to be filled. But I now want to talk particularly about women. Not only why we need more women entering the field, but why their presence in positions of leadership and decision making can actually change the way that water is governed. Because in most of the countries, there is a lack of representation of women in decision making circles in water governance. So we're going to start with Jessica. Jessica, you've been working with the Women in Water Diplomacy Network. You have been closely involved in efforts to strengthen women's participation and leadership in water governance. Why does having more women in these spaces matter? Not simply in terms of representation, but for the substantive and effective use of water governance and for the future of the field. Why would you think women need to be there?
Thank you. Yeah, no, this has been some of the most important and rewarding work that I've ever done. Years ago, I was asked to be faculty at a workshop in the Nile Basin, where we were going to bring together women who were foreign affairs representatives in their governments and women who were working in water and have the discussion around what kind of capacity needs to be built to encourage and strengthen women's participation in transboundary water governance in the Nile Basin in particular. And if for those of you who are not aware of Nile politics, Ethiopia and Egypt don't get along so well in that basin because of certain infrastructural developments and historical allocations that are now considered to be inequitable and those kinds of things. So it's been, to the point where they've talked about going to war in the past. They haven't, but it has really constrained the ability of the Nile Basin countries to develop a comprehensive framework for cooperation over the years that Egypt is willing to participate in. And so when we first we were in Uganda, which is, some will say, the head of the Nile. Others will argue it's farther down. And the women would sit with their backs to each other, the Ethiopian women and the Egyptian women. And there was clear tension in the room. We had 3 days of capacity building and interactive exercises and peer-to-peer learning facilitation and water diplomacy engagements. And I would say it only took one day before we started to realize that what we had in common was way more than the political differences that were making them nervous to talk to each other in a room because it might get back to their bosses. By the end of the conference, people were declaring, sisterhood and talking about the fact that we needed to have an agreement that we would continue this level of, I would say, track three diplomacy. Um, Track one diplomacy is between countries. Track two is really between organizations within countries, and then track three is kind of, at the level below that, interpersonal and sort of community level. But the idea is that the relationships that we built, the understanding of the common challenges that were faced, not just substantive challenges, but um, in terms of water management and climate change and all of the things, but as women working in water. we did a skit one night, and we had a lovely, amazing woman who had been an ambassador from Finland for many, many years, and she had negotiated peace treaties, and she was just this powerhouse of a woman. And she said to me, "Okay, we're going to do a skit, and we're going to do a skit on mansplaining." I think everyone knows what mansplaining is. So we did a skit where she was the man in the room, and I had a great idea, and she re-explained it to everyone and cut me off, and we had sort of the whole thing, and it was hilarious. It wound up like 2 hours. We were through dinner telling stories. Every single woman in that place had a something to share around this kind of experience. And fundamentally, this has led to, we continued to do technical trainings, and we realized as we were sharing this experience from the Nile with other places, women started to come up and say, we need this in our basin. We need to be able to connect with other women water professionals. We need capacity building. We need these opportunities. And so now we have a global women in water diplomacy network that I would invite you all to join. If reach out to me, please. Um, it has basin level organizations in Southern Africa, in Central Asia and Afghanistan, in the Nile Basin, of course, in the North American basins that are active as sort of sub networks. And it provides this incredible opportunity for women to share experiences, to share opportunities for training, for having resources. We have a shared library. We have joint research that we've come up with, and it really has been difficult to get sustained funding to support the network. And what's been incredible is that the basin level sub networks and individual women just keep going. They just keep participating and being active. We keep finding ways to connect with one another. There are a whole bunch of us at the um, World Water Week in Stockholm right now. There are side events at almost every global meeting on water where we have a get together for whoever can be there at the time for the Women in Water Diplomacy Network. We do have a global strategy that talks about how do we strategically improve women's participation in particularly transboundary water governance. And coming back to your question, ma'am, this is so critical because, I mean, I think we all know women hold historical, indigenous, practical, management, conservation, ecosystem-based knowledge that is completely different from the knowledge that men hold. And their experiences are, not completely different, but complementary and come from a different perspective. They have a different experience. They have different priorities for how water should be allocated and managed. They're often the household managers, but they're also the productive water use managers. Women account for over 43% of agricultural workforce, even if that's unpaid. And so, the idea that women are then excluded from decision making arenas is absurd. They're the ones who are making decisions at multiple levels. They are the innovators, they are the actors. And from a peace building and transboundary governance perspective, it's also been shown that when women are involved in forming agreements, they are much more likely to be durable over time than agreements that are concluded with only men in the room. Water projects, World Bank did a study, and I wish that we had more data on this. But when women are engaged in project development, structure, implementation, and monitoring, those projects tend to be more durable, more sustainable, and more equitable in terms of their outcomes. So there's substantive reasons, there's reasons of equity, but I mean, really, it just doesn't make sense to exclude women from decision making. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise, they have important skills And yet, we all know that women are continued to be excluded, particularly at the transboundary level, because it's not, engineering has not been a women's game. Water has not been a women's game. The technical areas have not traditionally been envisioned as areas into which women can go. And, even where you do get access to decision making, even where you are able to come to the table, there's often cultural and other, you know, um, reasons why women don't feel comfortable actually voicing their opinions or being straightforward about what they think or sharing their expertise and their knowledge. And so there's so many different levels at which we need to be working together as women across borders within transboundary basins and globally through networks like the Women in Water Diplomacy Network to understand that A, you're not alone. B, there are so many women out there who want to support you and share their knowledge and expertise to mentor and to provide experiences, opportunities, but also that are working strategically together to understand how to open these spaces in meaningful ways and to address the fundamental drivers that continue to exclude women from decision making from the local to the transboundary levels. So I think, the surge in support, the fact that we have this global community, and I would just come back to the fact that we have a WhatsApp group. This WhatsApp group is the most active thing that I have in my life. Every day I check the Women in Water Diplomacy WhatsApp group because people are saying things like, I just got appointed as, lead negotiator for blah, blah, blah. And then 300 women say, oh my God, that's incredible. Congratulations. What can we do to support you? All of those things. We also are women. So when someone has a grandbaby, they share it on the WhatsApp group and we all get to see the grandbaby pictures. And we have supported each other personally and professionally. It's been over a decade now, or about a decade now since we started this. So I would just say that from a professional standpoint, but also just from like from a personal standpoint, engaging with other women professionals, finding these networks. Again, reach out to me to start getting engaged with this. There are others, I'm sure that within your region, there are opportunities to engage with other women professionals, but there really is, I think, an upswell of understanding and recognition that these types of networks and this type of like coming together is an essential part of providing young professionals with the mentorship, guidance, and resources that they need to be able to forge a path for themselves in water. And I would just say take full advantage because it is just delightful. And I can go to any country in the world and I have an invitation to come to someone's home for dinner because of this network. It is just phenomenal. And I've been in 10, 12 different countries where I've had dinners with women from, 20 different places around the world and learned so much from them. So I could go on about the Women in Water Diplomacy Network, but um, yeah, it's one of the most critical and important things that we need to be doing is expanding spaces and really also I think from a local perspective, and I agree with you so much, Erum, on this idea that local solutions and local innovations are really where we need to be focusing. And you know, I think that you can bring the wealth of this knowledge back to your own locality and use it and really we're trying to leverage it all the time to raise more money to do joint research to provide more opportunities for formal mentorship. So watch this space and please do keep in contact with me for this.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and that's very helpful. I think taking a cue from you, and because Nida interacts with a lot of women who are struggling to find their ground. So if someone gets in touch with her regarding like water or career opportunities or mentorship, we will definitely, I'll give Nida your details so she can pass them along. So, taking a cue from what Jessica spoke about, we're going to now move on to Dr. Erum. Uh, Dr. Erum, you drawing on your experience working on water governance and policy in Pakistan, why do you think it is important to encourage more Pakistani women to enter the field of water governance? Because we also see that women are also like they see this as a male dominated field, and so they don't even see it as a viable career option. And what difference can greater women participation make to the way we understand and address Pakistan and like South Asia's water challenges?
So this is wonderful because, now everybody should basically just be in the, women in water diplomacy network and go from there. So this is wonderful. But I'll tell you what, so for me, what has been fascinating is when I was working when I was doing sort of like field work as a graduate student, it was kind of amazing. And Maham, you're absolutely identifying something very right. A lot of the spaces where this work is happening, basically there could be, either like literally like it could be like one woman in an entire office kind of thing, right? And she's not really doing the substantive work that is being done there. So these spaces are not really built to be inclusive to women. At the same time, and I will draw a little bit from my experience, what I am fascinated by is that if you are perceived as someone who does have something important to say, I have actually sort of been told by people where I'm the only person presenting, say this is in a room full of sort of, Pakistani professional men working in the water sector, especially from the public sector, like a huge network, where people have actually told me that you understand me presenting, you understand these issues better than basically anyone else assembled in this room who is listening to you. Now, why are they saying this? It's not that I like know so much more, right? What they're trying to say to me about when they're saying this to me, right, which is like a compliment. Okay, so why are they giving me this compliment? Because what they're saying is that you can look at things holistically. You are not siloed. And a lot of the people who are working in water governance, especially traditionally sort of men in the public sector, they are actually really just working on what is the thing that I'm here to do, and that's what I am doing. And that is getting done. And a lot of people don't have the luxury to sort of stand back and ask the questions of how is this whole system working together? So for me, that's what's important. And I think that could be something that could be a skill that women could bring to these spaces. Try and put a lot of complex things together, see it from this perspective, from that perspective, from that perspective. So, what is fascinating is, and I have experienced this completely, is when you are perceived as somebody who does have something to say, has built up some kind of knowledge and expertise and experience, you're actually really listened to. And that is amazing. So, one should never get dissuaded by saying, I'm not going to have anything to say or no one will welcome me. No, you will be welcome. Once you figure out what is it that your intervention is and you go and say it competently, you will be welcomed. So I'm actually always amazed by the openness of people to listen and to engage substantively with the ideas. Now, women know a lot, as I mentioned specifically, dairy sector involvement, right? So dairy is basically managed by women. Cattle is managed by women, other than some of the harder work that men do because, whatever, they're bigger and more muscular. But basically, all of the daily work of dairy is done by women, all of it. And it is a massive agricultural like contributor to sort of GDP also. So women engage in a lot of these spaces day to day. However, their labor and their knowledge is not built into these bigger networks of like, how is dairy agricultural policy set, right? And women don't engage with that. So I think that's on us. That is definitely on us because we should be saying, wait a second, who is running this thing? Who is running the foundation of this thing? Where does the knowledge exist? And the knowledge does exist in women. So if you are somebody who is, say, whatever, you graduate from somewhere and then you have the ability to, engage with people across the sector, whether it is in trying to do alternate energy sources or farm energy, any of those kinds of things, if you're able to do that, basically what you should be doing is going and making space and room to talk to people who are specifically undertaking the actual labor. And that's important. So, people sitting in offices, especially if you're a woman and you get into some kind of institution, some kind of organization, Your goal should be, well, how do I go talk to women who are actually undertaking so much of this labor? So for me, that's fascinating. These places can be open to you, but once you get in there, you have responsibility, right? Of saying, what is my voice here to do? Am I here to change something? I'll give you a specific example, and this is really fascinating. This is Pakistan again has lots of sort of focus on climate change. There is a Ministry of Climate Change. But one of the things that Pakistan suffers from is the fact that a lot of the work of the Ministry of Climate Change is not integrated into the other broader governance structure, right? So that's a huge problem. Even when you get a woman secretary who's like at the top, the boss, right? It could be that because of the way civil service works, this person could be posted out in 6 months or 8 months kind of thing. So then what is your substantive long-term contribution? And that's the other challenge. That's a government structure issue that we cannot face by ourselves. Like women can't go solve that structure, but women have to raise the question of, if somebody is here, if she's a woman, she's in a power position or she's in a position of authority, how long is she there to figure out what's happening, what are the structures of power, and then to be able to sort of imprint her voice and perspective on this area. So we have to like figure out how and why is that important. But these places are more open, perhaps surprisingly or unexpectedly, than you would think they are. It's just that no one is there, that then it just continues on in this way. But once you sort of like get your foot into the door and you start talking to people, you definitely get a lot more engagement, and sort of actually people are excited to listen to your voice because you do have something more to bring. And I will give you a specific example. The Indus Waters Treaty right now is very sort of like topically in the news. There's a huge challenge. India has put it into abeyance. Transboundary Water Corporation, as one of the things Jessica was saying, was when these were considered very technical subjects. So at the time the treaty was negotiated, in the 50s and then signed in 1960, there were basically no women negotiators anywhere in that space, right? But I have been in places such as the Indus Waters Commission in places like Lahore, and I have talked to many of those commissioners, and I have had deep conversations with them about what are the structural problems, what are the infrastructure issues, etc. And these are people who are daily engaged with, like, how do you engage with India on this in a transboundary level, right? So the issue is, I will just sort of like this, I will just, again, it's an anecdote, but anecdotes can be very, very useful. I have had commissioners literally say to me, we wish that our secretaries and our ministers were having with us the people who are daily involved with working with India on this, the kinds of conversations that you are having with us. People, in fact, are really, to use a water metaphor, really thirsty for our voices. And I will say this with all sincerity. Once you find your voice, once you feel like you have something to say, when you share it, people respond. And men respond, and it can change the structure of those places, those organizations. So I always think organizationally, I think structurally, but there is room, there is space, you will get heard, but you have to say something and you have to be able to speak it and defend it. And once you're able to do that, you will be included. You will be able to change voices. And when you're in the room, you have a space, you have a responsibility to say, you know what, actually, who is that woman who has the 4 cows that she is managing or the 2 buffalo that she is managing? And then how do we bring her voice into these same spaces too? So we not only have to open doors and get in, there is room for that. But once you're in, how are you going to be different? What are the voices you're going to bring to these spaces so that these spaces then actually do serve society in a broader way, in a way that, to include voices that have been excluded historically? And I think that's a responsibility.
Thank you, Dr. Erum. And I'm going to do the last round of questions because this has been very, very interesting for even women like me who have started their careers but are still looking as to where to go next. And and I'm going to talk a bit about my own journey working for the government in Pakistan as being usually the only woman in the room in the end. But now I'd like to end with just like advice for women who want to enter the sector. So, Jessica, looking back at your career, what is one lesson you've learned through the experience that you wish you would have known when you were starting out? And what advice would you give to young women hoping to build meaningful careers in water law, water policy, water diplomacy?
It's a really good question, and I've actually struggled to think about what is sort of the one thing that I would give as a takeaway for this. I think really to kind of try and tie a lot of what we've been talking about all, well, morning for me, um, afternoon, evening for others, tie together a lot of what we're talking about is don't let sort of the expectations, whether those are institutional expectations, cultural expectations, family expectations, all of those things, don't let those limit you in thinking about what it is that you're passionate about and what you want to focus on and what you think is important. I had a really interesting experience early in my career. I graduated from law school, and as I mentioned, I did two internships, and I had worked for my organization, ELI, as a research associate before going to law school. And right before my third year of law school, I interned as it was a clerkship program at the EPA Office, Environmental Protection Agency Office of General Counsel. Very prestigious. Um, I actually got to work in the International Environmental Law Office of the General Counsel. Um, and I thought, sort of ferreted away in that when everybody knew this is what, I wanted to do. I definitely wanted to do international work. That wasn't a lot of what the Office of General Counsel worked on. You know, they make one offer a year if they have any offers to give to a graduating attorney. I was in South Africa, as I mentioned. I created that externship program, and I was in Johannesburg when I got a call from the General Counsel saying that they wanted to offer me the position at EPA. And I had also applied for a fellowship at the Environmental Law Institute, which was a one-year program, severely underpaid. I will share with you now that I was the lowest paid lawyer in my graduating class, so you know which direction I wound up taking, except for a volunteer, which is very difficult when you're following your passion sometimes. But the story is meant to sort of say I struggled very, very hard because the pathway of going to the Office of General Counsel would have been the secure career pathway, a government position where I could have taken on, I wouldn't necessarily have worked on water or even international right away, but through the years, I would have created, legitimacy for myself, and you move around offices and you kind of prove yourself. But it's very secure, and it's very, and you do have great influence, and it's very prestigious. But I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew that I really wanted to focus on human rights and environment, on women's issues, on international and global issues. And I knew that going back to ELI, even for a year, would let me do that, start to build that pathway right away. So I took the much less secure route. And I took the fellowship, which turned into an offer to stay on as a staff attorney, which has been 25 years now. And I'm not saying it will always work out that way, but I just would recommend that, there are ways that are going to sort of funnel you, particularly as lawyers, that are going to funnel you into private sector or corporate law or, sort of things like that. And you'll think, oh, well, I can do this kind of on the side. But there are so many different ways through academia, through the private sector, even. And I would say one of the things that Dr. Erum raised around sort of the role of the private sector and the innovative ways in which we need to be thinking about non-legal solutions and voluntary compliance with environmental standards through the private sector. There's rooms for careers that can be quite lucrative, working with the private sector to influence those kinds of commitments and water stewardship initiatives. I would say just don't let those worn pathways guide you in directions that you feel like are not really following what it is that you're interested in or that you think should be the things that you should be working on. There are other ways. There are institutions and organizations that are working on it. You have to make the determination yourself when it comes to how much can I afford to get paid for the work that I'm doing, which is always honestly going to be a challenge in this work. I hate to say it, but I have struggled my whole career with saying I will take a much lower salary to be able to do work that I am fully 100% committed to. And I have had the honor and privilege of being able to make that work. I will not retire young, that is sure. I will continue working on, but I want to continue working. That's the trade-off. I want to keep doing this work. I don't want to retire. I love what I do. I love the people I work with. Um, and the other thing I would say is look for opportunities that can defray the costs of doing what you're passionate about. My law school actually had a public interest law repayment program. So if you took a job that made less than a certain amount of money and qualified in the public interest, they helped pay your school loans back so that you could take that job and not have to worry about repaying your school loans. There are organizations that are set up to do things like that. So it may be a lot more work to follow your passion, to follow the direction that you think you want to go into. It may be less well paid, but I would just say follow your heart, and look for opportunities that you can structure yourself. Because I think, as Dr. Erum said, once you've got the knowledge, once you've got the expertise, you're valuable, you're worthwhile and valuable in multiple settings. Don't undervalue yourself. Create the opportunities for yourself and don't be afraid to apply for positions that you think may be challenging or above your station, because you never know. You can apply for positions, you might not get them. This happened to me and my husband both, and then 4 years later someone came back and said, hey, I have your CV here, what do you think? There's just opportunities that are out there. So that's, I think I would say, it's not necessarily a succinct one, but it is a bigger lesson for me from my early career.
Thank you, Jessica. That was a very good sum up of also keeping it real as to what's out there and the financial aspect of it as well. I've faced that myself, so I can completely understand. And I was also on a similar loan repayment program for my LLM as well, in which if you work for the public interest, it would pay back. So I went to work for the Pakistan's government then. So that would now move on to our last question with Dr. Erum. So, Dr. Erum, for young women considering careers in water governance, where do you see the most promising opportunities emerging in Pakistan, particularly, and also for Pakistani women, Pakistan or South Asia generally prepare themselves to take advantage of these opportunities?
So you were slightly breaking up there, but I think I get the question. So I think I'm really going to pick up a lot on what Jessica said. I think the idea needs to be, and you need to be committed. And once you're committed, and I assure you that I did not think 15 years ago when I began studying water that this is what I would still now be so heavily engaged in across so many domains. So opportunities will come. You have to do the work. You have to be really interested in what you're doing and studying, and hopefully that's a passion. And absolutely, you will probably take a, financial hit, but you will make up for it in so much of the satisfaction of having a voice that people will listen to, that people will reach out to you and gravitate towards. The kinds of places where I now get to speak and engage with people, I could not have foreseen it. So, what I would recommend to people, and especially young women, sort of wanting to do this massively interesting work. I mean, I assure you, when I sort of like, whatever, if you're in like, if you're getting a ride and, it's like the ride guy asks you, like, what do you do? And you're like, I work on water. And everybody, in a way, first hears that as like you walk on water, which is, I was like, Abs of course, yes. So, and then you get through that, and then you have this really interesting conversation. Whose lives does water not touch? Nobody's, okay? Everyone has some water connection. There's no doubt about that. So it's a really fascinating thing to do. And I assure you, opportunities will present themselves. There will be that one person who will have had that one conversation with you at that one conference, and they will come back to you next year and say, you know what, we're doing a panel. Can we please have you on it? Right? And it just keeps going. And there you'll meet other people. Someplace else, you'll meet other people. I've literally had people, last year there was a major conference. This was, sort of like on, so the students basically came up to me at that conference. They were attending it, and they said it was a conference full of people and amazing panelists. And I actually had people come to me and say to me, we have read every single thing you have written, and we are here at this conference only to meet you. That satisfaction of a student coming to you and saying, I'm here at this conference, which has like 80 panelists, to only meet you is irreplaceable. And as so like when you talk to like other people, other fellow panelists, I mean, one of the people we'll always say is, you know what, that's why you write. That's why you speak, so that it may reach people and it may inspire other people. Like that's why you do what you do. It could be isolating, it takes a lot of work, it's complicated, but the satisfaction is unbeatable, and that is its own reward. And that's what I would encourage people to do. If you're passionate, literally from disaster relief to what is very boring, clean drinking water work, but so necessary for public health and welfare. So anything you're interested in, if you start doing it in some way, then it'll go from place to place to place. There are the informal networks, there are university networks. We literally had made something which was like a Boston area water study group, which was across universities. People would come at all levels, researchers, professionals, community members, and those conversations just over a simple dinner still, and those relationships are still what keep me going. And they come back again and again and again. So wherever you are, if you can reach out to even six other people at, any place and just like sit down and start talking about it, it grows and grows and grows, and opportunities grow. So it's because it's not as structured, right? Because you're not going to go get an MBA and then do XYZ, right? And go work in consulting. So if the pathway is not as clean as this, or if you go to law school, I'm going to go get a corporate job, right? It's not as clear as that. It's actually much more interesting. It's much more creative. There's so many opportunities to make for yourself, to take and to really create, because this world is getting into massive uncertainty, massive instability. And a world of massive instability and uncertainty is, in a way, exactly what you have to learn to thrive in. To say, you know what, this is crazy and it is exciting and I can do something useful here. So you have to kind of have that energy. And that once you can develop that energy has its own rewards, and you will not see them coming. And you will look back decade after decade and you will think, oh my God, how is this even happening? Like, how am I even here? How am I in these spaces where very accomplished people are talking and trying to develop something? And somebody thought I should be in these rooms and spaces too. So you look back and you'll not believe that that's what happened, but it will happen. But so get in, be a little crazy, be a little more creative. These things will come to you.
I have to say, just following up on your walk on water comment really quickly, because I think this is a great way for me to end. Similarly, when I first moved to Zimbabwe, I was sitting at a dinner with someone and they said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm an environmental lawyer." And they looked at me like this. And I said, "What?" And she said, "Wait, what did you just say?" I said, "I'm an environmental lawyer." And she said, I thought you said environmental warrior. And I was like, I am changing my business card.
Exactly.
I am an environmental warrior. I'm a water warrior. And to be honest, that is how it feels. I mean, and just to share, 10 years ago I started this work on water tenure, and we thought to ourselves, wouldn't it be amazing if we ended this work with creating global principles for more responsible water tenure governance? I'm about to go present draft global principles on responsible water tenure governance to the FAO Technical Committee on Food Security in October. It's overwhelming. I feel very nervous about the whole thing, and I'm hoping it gets taken up politically. But it is as exactly as Dr. Erum said. You follow your passion, you do the work, you commit yourself to it, and you will be amazed at what's possible and the spaces in which you can come into. And don't limit yourself. Just don't limit yourself. Be an environmental, be a water warrior, and walk on water.
That's right. Go walk on water. That's right.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Erum. We're almost at the end of our tour session, and I would want to say this is one of the very few sessions that have like flown by, and we've covered the entire 2 hours because it was so interesting. I would now like to open the floor for questions very quickly. In like 2 minutes, if someone has a question, please either write it in the chat or raise your hand, and I can ask you to speak up. Uh, so there is one question online which I feel which Nida is asking, I think for the benefit of everyone, is that can you guys share any online opportunities or courses that students can pursue here while they wait for universities to start their own local courses if they ever will? So any like online courses or online databases that students in Pakistan can use?
Yeah, and not just that. I mean, I just want to add to that that since, opportunities in Pakistan are limited, but the world has become much more accessible now because of technological developments. So, I mean, there could be online courses, or there could even be like maybe some interesting people that one could follow, or some interesting YouTube videos, maybe that, people could uh, start their journey in water law with. So if you can share some resources or identify some maybe organizations other than the ones that of course you're working in, because we know about those now, but if there's any other interesting sort of resource or reference for to get somebody started in this field, what would that look like? If there are any opportunities that can be accessed online, preferably free of cost, because people have that issue as well here, because the courses are generally very expensive. So again, that's a barrier for most of the people in Pakistan to access. So what would the recommendations on that would be? And any one of the speakers could answer that, or both, whichever one.
I'm happy to jump in. I've got a couple off the top of my head. First, I would say that my organization, the Environmental Law Institute, does conduct massive online open courses, MOOCs, on a bunch of different topics, including environmental peace building and diplomacy. And so happy to share those opportunities with you. And usually those are free for registration and taking them. Additional organizations that I would look into if you're interested in water law, water diplomacy, is that Delft has the UNESCO Center at Delft has a graduate school there, and they often do online courses that you can sign up for that have student rates. The University of Geneva Water Hub also has online courses that they do, and they can often have discounts for international student rates. And then I am an active member of the International Water Law Association, AIDA. And so if you're particularly interested in water law, it's a great organization, and they also have, I think, highly discounted rates for students to join. And there are webinars, and there are opportunities to do professional mingling with water lawyers and people who work in relation in that space. So AIDA, it's AIDA. It's actually based in Italy because the founding member Stefano Borghi is a wonderful Italian water lawyer who used to work for FAO for many years. But so AIDA, AIDA is the International Water Law Association. So those are just some resources. And please reach out to me if you want to follow up.
So those are all absolutely great, and I would recommend all of them. And the thing that I would encourage people to do is, how do you get sort of like more of the Pakistani centric knowledge? And for that, you have to do a little more work, but that also is out there. There are plenty of resources where, there are talks, there's conferences, there are, specifically for Pakistan, if you remember, in May this year, this was second year of the Dawn Pakistan Breathe Conference, which is a climate change conference, absolutely free to attend. And it was incredible. It was 2 full days of people who were there. And I met so many people there, students who were attending from around the country, and absolutely free. So there are lots of local organizations that will let you attend also. And by the way, all of that is live streamed. So all of that is on their YouTube channel. So you can basically watch the entire proceedings. You learn a lot. You learn connections about who's where. You can be interested in energy security or agriculture, for instance. Whatever your interest is, there are people there. There were people there from the UN across the board. So that kind of like local opportunity, local organization, do look out for also, because it may be possible. I mean, that happened to be in Islamabad if you're there. There's also a sort of like a water center in Karachi that is with NED University. They do a lot of courses, and a lot of them are very, very sort of, like well priced. If you're not a student, but they're very, very good. And they put together a lot of experts. That is every 2 years. So it's not this year, but 2027, that conference will be happening. So if I were you, I would look out for that also. So there are local opportunities, and look at the local institutions also, because they're actually doing very good work. I was very impressed with what the Dawn Pakistan, sort of the Breathe conference did, because it was incredible. It was international, local, people across. And again, all of that is on YouTube, and you could like find that, reach out to anyone there, and I think people would be very engaged. So there's a way to get the international certifications, which Jessica sort of like, sort of like really highlighted well, but please look at the local organizations also, because those are actual opportunities.
Thank you. And I think with the Karachi, we also had Simi Kamal come in for one of the sessions. So her organization also does a lot of work, the Hisar Foundation. So would also be something that is interesting to look at. Great. I think that brings us to a wrap to today's session. I could not have thought of better women to end the Women in Water Governance session for the Women in Law Initiative. I would like Nida to say a couple of words, because she actually founded the Women in Law Initiative, their Pakistan chapter. So it's a global one. And Nida has been kind enough to always give a platform to anyone who wants to share anything related to women law and any other profession. And she also mostly funds it out of her own pocket at times as well. So she is like still going at it strong for a crazy amount of years. But Nida, over to you.
Thank you, Maham, but you've got our history entirely wrong. So, Women in Law Initiative Pakistan is entirely independent, and it started 2 years before the one in Vienna. So, while we are sister organizations, but we're not associated or affiliated or a chapter of theirs in Pakistan. But I know because of the same name, this confusion is something that I've started facing. And honestly, I feel that there is a lot of Eurocentrism in this idea that just because based in Vienna, so everybody just assumes that they're probably the parent organization or something. So I get that a lot. But we started, yeah, 2 years before they did. So I just wanted to put that on record. Having said that, we do have a great association with them, of course, and we network with them and liaison with them on issues that we share concerns in, which of course is around opportunities for female lawyers, legal professionals, And in that same stride, Maham, I want to basically take this moment to appreciate and thank you for what you have done for us in terms of curating these six very, very important, pertinent sessions. You've been at it since May. You've been doing the legwork for it. You've been reaching out to all the fantastic lineup of speakers, each one more brilliant than the other. I really cannot actually, I mean, after every session, I feel, oh, this was so good. Oh, this was so insightful. But that's truly because of the kind of hard work you have put into it by getting all these wonderful, amazing professionals to our platform, which is literally just a start as far as branching out to these niche areas is concerned, as far as women law is concerned. Because I mean, the idea was to bring this very niche, sort of underserved area in terms of, what women lawyers in the group were generally concerned about. That's always been about, like, more conversation has been about gender-based violence or, family law and constitutional law, but these areas that affect all our lives, water being so central to each one of our lives, as we've reinforced in these six sessions. I think there needs to be a lot more conversation. Even though we've had six sessions over the summer, it still feels like there's so much more to talk about. So hopefully next summer, or maybe at some point again, we can, reconvene and look at this in more detail or with some other concepts. We went through AI and water and governance. We looked at marginalized communities. We talked about career opportunities. We talked about gender specifically with Miss Simi Kamal. I mean, there's been such diversity and range that you've brought to this platform, Maham. I am so grateful to you. And this is really an opportunity to thank you for all your hard work. And I'm so, so happy that you chose to do this with us. And at the conclusion of these series, I mean, this is just, from Women Law, a thank you note to you and to each one of our speakers for taking the valuable time out and for having these wonderful conversations with us, which we've recorded. And so they will be available on our YouTube channel for all times to come, hopefully till the time our channel is there, so people can access them at any point that they want to. So I really, really appreciate every contributors time and energy that has gone into it. Particularly today also, Jessica and Dr. Erum, thank you so much for joining us, and to all our previous speakers as well, thank you for being there for us. To the audience and to those participants who sent in their queries on the form that we circulated for registration, thank you for your input and time as well. And my team who's been working to put together these sessions in writing as well, sort of, making it more social media friendly and reducing these 2 hour sessions into accessible social media summaries and posts. Thank you for all your hard work as well. It's been a team effort, and together we've been able to curate these series for the benefit of female lawyers and other interested professionals in this very niche area. We hope that this is just the start of, the many more conversations that will follow. On that note, I thank everyone and each one of you once more. Thank you so much, Maham, for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That
Thank
was
you so
lovely.
much.
Really great conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, ji.
Bye-bye.
Hafiz, take care.
Hafiz.